Moses stood barefoot on holy ground, a runaway shepherd watching a bush burn without turning to ash. Every muscle told him to back away. He'd spent 40 years hiding from his past, and now a voice was cutting through the silence, calling his name. He didn't answer with confidence. He buried his face in his hands because he was afraid to look at God. The commission that followed didn't ask for his skills. It demanded something he believed he'd never possess: the ability to stand before Pharaoh and demand the release of an entire nation. Moses didn't offer a strategy. He offered 4 objections, each one a confession of personal deficiency. Who am I? What if they don't believe me? I'm not eloquent. Please send someone else. 4 reasons he couldn't do it. That's the pattern. God finds a person in a crisis they didn't create and appoints them to confront it, not because they're qualified, but because their fear has stripped away every illusion of self-sufficiency. The same dynamic plays out with Gideon, who was threshing wheat in a winepress, hiding from the Midianite raiders. When the angel of the Lord appeared and called him a mighty warrior, Gideon didn't bow in reverence. He questioned the entire premise. If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened? He wasn't a hero in waiting. He was a farmer convinced God had abandoned his people. Gideon's response lays bare the inner logic of divine crisis management. Strength is never the prerequisite. The prerequisite is a kind of desperate clarity, the knowledge that you cannot fix what's broken. Moses had that clarity. Gideon had it too, buried under layers of cynicism. Both men looked at the chaos in front of them and saw only their own lack. And that's exactly what God wanted. The question that lingers isn't whether these reluctant leaders eventually acted. It's what happens in that split second when a person stops listing their limitations and says yes to a power that isn't their own. What changes when the weak step forward, not in spite of their fear, but because they've run out of other options? Clarity doesn't come in a boardroom. Nehemiah knew this. The sun had set over Jerusalem, and he didn't tell a soul what he was about to do. He mounted his horse, a small escort behind him, and rode into the darkness. He'd spent days sitting with the city's broken walls, but he hadn't spoken a word of action. Nehemiah inspected the damage alone. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't rally the troops. He walked among the collapsed gates and charred beams, letting the reality of the disaster sink deep into his bones. Private assessment is not weakness. It's the only way to see clearly when panic screams for a reaction. David did the same thing, though his crisis was personal. When Amalekites burned Ziklag and took his family, his own men talked of stoning him. First, he strengthened himself in the Lord. Then he didn't charge into the desert. He stopped. He insisted on one more conversation. He sought guidance, not once but twice, before making a move. That pause saved everything. Leaders who skip the quiet forfeit their chance to hear the voice that matters most. The adrenaline of crisis rewards speed, but wisdom whispers slow down. Nehemiah's night ride and David's inquiries were not delays. They were the soil where divine strategy grows. You might face a moment right now where the walls are down and the fire's still smoldering. Your instinct will be to fix it publicly, to issue a statement, to do something. But the biblical pattern invites you to a different first step. To go out at night, to kneel in the dirt, to ask one more question before unsheathing your sword. Because God doesn't always speak in the storm. Sometimes you have to step out of the wind to hear him. The question isn't whether you're willing to act. It's whether you're willing to wait long enough to get it right. Abraham's hands didn't shake. That's the part that gets me. He woke before sunrise, split the wood himself, and saddled his donkey. No speech to Sarah. No farewell breakfast. Just a servant, 2 men, and his son Isaac walking toward Moriah. He'd heard God's voice before, but never like this. Take your son, your only son, the one you love, and offer him as a burnt offering. The command made no sense. It contradicted every promise God had made about descendants outnumbering the stars. Abraham had no doctrine of resurrection to fall back on. No precedent in Scripture. No fellow believer to consult. He had a directive and 3 days of walking to think about it. 3 days to turn around. 3 days to rationalize a way out. He kept walking. The knife stayed in his belt. The fire stayed in his hand. This is the agony of command. Not the agony of suffering, but the agony of choosing when the outcome is invisible. Abraham didn't know the ram was coming. He just knew the voice was real, and that had to be enough. Surrender doesn't look like defeat. It looks like Jesus collapsing forward onto the dirt, his forehead grinding against the cold ground. The olive grove outside Jerusalem held his full weight that night. He didn't negotiate. He didn't draft a revised escape plan. He just kept pressing his face into the earth, asking if the cup could pass. The sweat fell like blood, and the disciples couldn't stay awake to see it. His soul was overwhelmed to the point of death, but the breaking came in 6 words. Not my will, but yours. The crisis wasn't the approaching soldiers. The crisis was a human will that had to shatter before it could align with heaven's strategy. Most leaders assume the storm is the problem. The raging sea, the collapsing market, the diagnosis, they fixate on the external. But Paul stood on the deck of a grain ship in a hurricane that had blotted out the sun for days and showed no signs of panic. He'd already surrendered his will years earlier, blinded on a road, and he never took it back. Now, with 276 men hollow-eyed from fasting, he broke bread in the middle of the chaos and gave thanks out loud. That act came from a man whose internal posture had been rearranged long before the storm hit. Composure in catastrophe doesn't get manufactured in the moment. It gets installed during the breaking. A yielded will spots the escape hatch before the professionals see it. When the sailors lowered the skiff on pretense, Paul told the centurion to stop them. He said unless those men stayed with the ship, nobody survived. The centurion had to surrender his own judgment. Sailors knew the sea. Paul was a prisoner. But he cut the ropes and trusted the man who had already died to himself. The breaking point shifted from external survival to internal alignment, and the whole ship experienced the pivot. The leader's surrender bought permission for everyone else to let go. Paul urged them to eat. 14 days without food ends a person's ability to think. He took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and ate first. Men who had given up hope started chewing. Then they took the last of the grain, the one remaining provision, and tossed it into the sea. Throwing food overboard during a famine-level crisis violates every instinct. But that was the moment the hull scraped a sandbar. The rescue didn't begin with divine intervention. It began when they released their grip on the one thing they still controlled. The breaking point was never the ship hitting rocks. It was the wheat hitting the waves. Gethsemane and that Maltese beach share a single frame. What happens inside the leader becomes the hinge. Jesus rose from the dirt with a stillness that let him walk straight into an arrest. Paul shook a viper into the fire and healed the islanders. Both men carried a weight they couldn't have lifted before their will died. Their authority didn't come from surviving a crisis, it came from surrendering inside one. So once your will shatters, what settles in the empty space? And what do you suddenly find yourself able to carry that felt impossible the day before? The charcoal fire crackled again. Peter smelled it before he saw it, the same bitter smoke that filled the courtyard when he swore he'd never known the man. Now Jesus was cooking breakfast on the shore, and Peter stood waist deep in his old life, hauling empty nets. The resurrection had already happened, but Peter had no idea what to do with it. He'd gone back to fishing because leadership felt too heavy for a man who'd failed in the dark. Jesus didn't let him off easy. 3 times he asked, "Do you love me?" One for every denial. The first time, Peter answered with bravado. The second time, his voice dropped. By the third, the charcoal smoke curled into his lungs and he wept. The reinstatement wasn't a clean slate, it was a deeper wound reopened so it could heal straight. Then Jesus handed him a new weight. "Feed my lambs, tend my sheep." Not go back to being the rock you were before, but shepherd a flock you now understand because you've been scattered yourself. Job's restoration came just as strangely. The man who'd scraped his sores with broken pottery sat in the ash heap long enough for his theology to die. When God finally spoke from the whirlwind, he didn't explain the suffering. He asked Job where he was when the foundations of the earth were laid. Job's answer wasn't a testimony of triumph, it was a hand clamped over his own mouth. He'd heard about God with his ears, but now his eyes had seen, and he loathed himself in dust. That was the moment restoration began. Before a single replacement child, before a single new flock, Job was remade in silence. Then God doubled it all. The livestock, the children, the years, but the most important return wasn't material. Job now led with a limp. He named his daughters and gave them an inheritance alongside their brothers, something no patriarch had done. The crisis had burned away his entitlement to answers, and what replaced it was a quiet authority that didn't need to justify itself. He could carry future weight because he no longer believed he was the one holding it all together. Peter and Job both emerged with calloused hands and clearer eyes. The biblical pattern isn't a bounce back. It's a remaking that leaves the leader more dangerous to darkness and safer for the wounded. You don't just survive the collapse. You rise with a capacity you didn't have before, not because you're stronger, but because you've stopped pretending you're immune to breaking. The question lingering in the rubble isn't whether you'll lead again. It's what kind of leader you'll become when